provide the same service. So I think an update would be very useful, and I've worked closely with our colleagues in Congress to help make that a success.
Republican FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai, tonight on The Communicators at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
Next on American History TV, we revisit the space program's earliest days as we hear from Wally Funk, one of the 13 women selected by NASA to be the First Lady Astronaut Trainees, or FLATs. This group of women is sometimes called the Mercury 13, as they underwent some of the same physiological tests as their male counterparts, the Mercury 7 astronauts. Unlike the Mercury 7, however, these women never flew a NASA mission. Funk was interviewed as part of the NASA Johnson Space Center Oral History Collection. This is about 50 minutes.
This is Carol Butler, and I'm doing an oral history for the NASA History Office with Wally Funk, retired NTSB investigator, senior flight instructor, chief pilot, wonderful woman of aerospace. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
To begin, if we could talk briefly about your early career and your interest in aviation developing and how you moved forward into the aerospace career as a woman.
Well, aerospace really was not a name in my young life, but flying airplanes was. And I got my first try at flying, just pure flying, by flying my Superman cape off my daddy's barn when I was about 5 years old. And then I was allowed to make airplanes out of blocks of balsa wood and then hang them from my ceiling. When I went on to college, I was allowed to take flying, as my mother had dearly loved flying and her father wouldn't allow her to. So they encouraged me then to go on into my aviation career. I was at a girls' school for 2 years, got my private there. Then I went on to Oklahoma State University, who was the best flight school in the United States at that time, from say the 50s, mid-50s on through to the 70s. And I'm a national, international judge for SafeCon performances for all schools, universities, and colleges. So now I'm giving back the safety that I've learned over my 44 years of instruction to the kids that are just starting out in the flying that I started in the late 50s. So it all has come around full circle. Oklahoma State afforded me most of the rest of all my ratings. I would trade off mowing grass between the runways for my glider rating or my seaplane rating. And that was a great experience as a kid of 19 doing such things. And there was never any eyes raised or eyebrows raised about, what's that girl doing? I had great parental enthusiasm and helping me to continue my education that I wanted in aviation. And it wasn't until I graduated from Oklahoma State and went down to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where I was a flight instructor, that I learned about Jerry Cobb had been in phase 2 off the magazine cover of Life magazine. And I wrote immediately to the doctor that had used her as a subject, was Dr. Sechrist at the VA hospital. He puts me in touch with Dr. Randy Lovelace at Albuquerque, New Mexico. And within 2 days, Dr. Lovelace writes back, fill out this form and your date is a month away. Can you come? So I was not on the original list, and I was 21 and I was too young. So they had to get extra permission for me to take the same test as the Mercury 7 astronauts took. Now they have picked 25 women candidates out of the records there weren't records in Washington, D.C. in those days. Or yes, there were, and at 99 headquarters. But it wasn't as it is today, so comprehensive. They found women that had a college education, over 1,000 hours of flight time, and had to have a commercial instrument rating, top physical condition, and be willing to go through these tests. So I said, yes, of course I want to go, and yes, of course get information for me to go because I'm just a kid. Well, it turned out that was to my benefit because I had no preconceived ideas of what was going to happen in any of these tests. I had no idea that things could be done to my body and to my mind that they did do as a youngster, as you will. Being a grown-up now, I might have had some reservations going in, as many of the other women probably did. I took a lot of pain that was associated with some of the tests that we took. I took it in stride. It was going to get me one step closer into space, and this is where I wanted to go. And of course, I did as much as I could in space exploration for physical tests, psychological tests as possible to get me into absolutely a race for space against Russia in those days. So it's interesting to know that 25 women were put through the tests, but 13 passed. So that's why we're called the Mercury 13. Now, unfortunately, the lady that we went through by twos, but the lady that I went through never made it through the first day. And I really didn't know, we all didn't know who each other were. Not until 4 years ago did we know who each other were in total. And of course, I was in a flourishing field of my own, so I didn't get to go to some of these meetings that the other women could go to because they were retired and I was still working. But we finally all got together and have exchanged stories, and I hope that you're going to get many of these gals' stories. I applied to NASA 4 different times, to be turned down 4 different times because I did not have an engineering degree, and they gave me 9 months to obtain such a degree, which was an impossibility. Jerry Cobb and I had at one time described that we would buy a jet aircraft from England, which was called a Small Vampire, but then NASA reorganized their nomenclature, so to speak, that you had to have jet test pilot time. This was impossible for a girl to have in those days. I mean, it's taken us 30 years for Eileen to go up into space, and she was the first girl to be able to go through Edwards Air Force Base. So she was 20 years in front of us. So the thing that I'm most happy about is that Eileen is going to be in that left seat in less than 2 days. She had a vision, and at 5 she knew that she wanted to fly, and she patterned her life. There was at least enough knowledge out there to pattern one's life, to know that she had to get her licenses, she had to go into the Air Force. She blossomed in the Air Force, got on with NASA. This is her 2nd trip up, but we've got a girl in the left seat, and that is just absolutely incredible. And this is going to show youngsters and young ladies that are going to see this particular program that you can do anything you want to do with your life. Math, sciences, engineering, very important to stick with and have as your personal goals. Eileen's tenacity, her personal goals, her dedication has made it possible for you and I to come together, and a lot of people from around the world to come together.
Absolutely. It's fabulous. Absolutely. Before you got involved in the testing program, had you thought about even the possibility of going into space before?
Before I read about Jerry Cobb, I didn't even know about it. It was not something we knew about. It was just as new as new. We didn't know what astronaut meant.
And so you just jumped into it.
Absolutely.
Anything.
I knew that that was for me. I wanted to go into exploration. I've always sort of been an explorer in my youth.
Great. And you've continued to be an explorer. You're exploring still.
Yes, I hope to go on to Russia with the Zigrum voyages and be a part of a cross-training of American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts so that we can use their facility at Star City and go through some of the same tests that Eileen's gone through in Houston. I've been down to Houston many times. I've observed what she has done and what the astronauts are doing down there, but I could never have the chance of partaking in such a wonderful schooling.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how the training that you're able to go through in Star City measures up with the testing and training that you did do earlier when you first started out as a 21-year-old, not knowing anything about the space opportunities.
Well, what's interesting about your statement is we've come such a long way in technology that the things that I was tested on, people aren't tested on anymore. They were testing us to our extremes, to how much can we take of 10-degree water being injected into our ears, and how fast is our eye going to stare at a particular object, and I'd have no control over my body. And was I going to fall off or not? And yes, I would have if I wouldn't have been strapped into a dentist chair. Or what would I do in a tank of water that was so, and the humidity of the room that was so perfectly controlled to my temperature that I couldn't feel the water on my hands or my face because there was no hearing, smelling, all your sights, all of your senses were taken away from you. And you were to stay in there as long as possible, and I broke the record of 10 hours and 35 minutes.
That must have been a very interesting experience.
Well, you know, it was so easy for me. As a youngster then, you didn't have a lot on your mind, as youngsters today do. And the question always comes up, well, how could you stand 10 hours and 35 minutes? On the contrary, when they said, how long do you think you've been in there? I said, oh, I wasn't hungry. I didn't have any bodily needs. About 5 hours. So everybody that has taken this particular test has cut their time in half, which is unbeknownst to the scientists today. In an isolation situation, everyone cuts their time in half. Now the guys, the Mercury 7, were set in a lit room. Well, you know, you can count a lot of things in a lit room and entertain yourself. Where I was on my back, floating in this water with all my 5 basic senses taken away, couldn't smell, touch, taste, anything, and just had to lay there. Now, they wanted me to talk or to sing, but in those days I didn't talk. This would be a very difficult interview if this was a long time ago. But I've learned to talk since then.
Well, that's good. You mentioned a couple of the other tests, the water in the ear. What were some of the other, as you came down for the first phase of testing, what were some of those tests? And at any point did you stop and think, what am I doing? Or anything along those lines?
To answer your last question first, no, I had not a shadow of the doubt. I was their subject. They could do anything with me that they wanted to do. And I didn't know that you could get x-rayed from head to toe and it would take a whole day and every single tooth and every single bone. But they wanted perfect specimens at that time. Now let's go back to the men, the Mercury. There were 159 men selected from the armed services to go through these tests at Loveless. How many were selected?
7.
25 women were selected, and how many passed? 13. So do we have a little bit of information here on how well do women do things? How well did they come across on the Mayflower? Terrific. How well did they go across the prairies and settle the West in their covered wagons? Great. Big families, didn't think anything about it. Why can't we fly and go into space? For the men today that think that we can't as women do things, sorry folks, we can do it. A woman, and I'm sure Eileen, has tried extra hard to do her best because nobody wants to fail. And failure is not a part of my makeup. I do the best I can do, and I kick as many doors in as I possibly can, no matter where I go.
And you have fun doing it,
Oh
I'm
yes,
sure.
I love life, you bet.
That's wonderful. That's the way to do it. You gotta enjoy life as you're going. As you were doing the testing, you said you didn't know any of the other women that were going through it, but you had, of course, read about Jerry Cobb. After you were done with the first phase, what contact did you have with people running the program or with Dr. Lovelace, or how did it continue that you could go on with the next phases of the testing?
I found out what Jerry Cobb had done down in Pensacola, because she had done this about 6 months to a year prior to my going through. Oops.
We were talking about how you became involved in the second round of the testing and how you found out even about the opportunity.
Well, the second round of testing would be what Jerry Cobb had gone through in Pensacola, Florida. And we were to have had a chance to go down, but it was all scrubbed, most likely a political situation. But a lot of the girls were disappointed in that, but I kind of went on to a alternate, if you will, and I went overseas for 3 years. And I learned a lot about many countries. I was in 59 countries, and I did a lot of camping and met a lot of neat people that I still stay in correspondence with. But anyway, I learned what the Pensacola tests were all about. So I kind of made a list of what I could do in California and various states. So at USC, I was able to take the centrifuge test. Now, being a civilian and being a girl, they would only give me 3 Gs, and I could not have a G suit. Only men could have those things. So I called Mother up in Hemet, California, and I said, Mom, I need your worst Merry Widow and girdle when you were a girl. Can you get those to me? You betcha. So I modified and made my own G-suit out of her Merry Widow and just stuffed my body in this tight little thing and then put my flight suit over it, because I knew once they started to twirl me around in the centrifuge, obviously they thought that I was going to go out within the first go-round of 3 Gs, but I knew to keep the blood rushed up in my body and up in my head. So obviously they gave me 3 Gs for 2 minutes at a time, and the cameras were set at different places. Okay, we went second round. No big deal. I punched out the buttons of lights that were coming up for my assignments. Third time around, no big deal. Feeling a little tired, but it was okay. Fourth time around, I don't know if the guy really hit the button and gave me a few more Gs, or it was really that many more Gs, or that same amount of Gs, but my body not having a rest in between. But what happens is when you're going around this long arm, extended arm, going around this room very, very quickly and trying to punch out the different lights that they're giving you as assignments, you start the gray out. And when the gray out effect starts is when the blood is coming down from your brain and about half masked to your eyes. Part of it's gray and the rest I could see you. Well, I knew that was happening, so I just clenched up my body and my neck, and I pushed all that blood back up in my head, and it cleared up. So then I could keep doing my thing. I never told them until it came out in Dateline 25-some years later that I had made my own G-suit, and I passed with flying colors.
That's great.
Then the other test was the Martin Baker seat ejection test at El Toro, and that is where I was placed in a particular flight suit and parachute rig, and I was shot up on a long, long pole. It's almost like to go hit the gong and then come down with a crash. And I was a lightweight. I only weighed about 110 pounds then. And so obviously I went up as far up as the slide would go, but came down with a terrible thud, not really realizing what was happening. And to make this thing go, there was kind of like a lot of powder, like not dynamite or not like a lot of firecrackers, but like a bunch of firecrackers, I guess you could say, underneath my seat. And what I did was I'd pull this canopy up over my helmet, keep my head rigidly back against the back headrest so that my head wouldn't come forward because you could break your neck, and ride the post up. But coming down with a thud, I didn't realize it, but the guys knew it. I would have a tremendous headache, and you could have a back compression. Well, I had never told anybody I'd broken my back skiing, trying to prepare for the Olympics. So I thought, uh-oh, wonder if anything has happened here. But nothing happened. I was fine. So I just got off. They took all the gear off me, and The next thing, they just ushered me right into the high altitude chamber test. And in those days, they could take a civilian up to 39,000. Today, it's only 29,000. And we zoomed on up there, and boy, on 100% oxygen, I was feeling great. I mean, that's just the best way to, they say get over a hangover or to get rid of a headache is to breathe 100% oxygen. So I was feeling great, and of course, here comes the test. Wally, take your mask off. So I take my mask off. Now we want you to write your name and anything you want, and then add some numbers on this piece of paper. So at that altitude, you can only last a matter of 10, 15 seconds without oxygen again. So I'm writing, and I think I'm doing just really terrific because you have a euphoria and a feeling of well-being here without oxygen. And this is how come a lot of airplane people have accidents, because they have a feeling of euphoria and they're not getting the right oxygen to their brain to read their instrumentation correctly, and then they get into trouble. Well, of course, we had a lot of noses pressed up against every window looking at this girl in there, because they'd never had a girl before, wondering how she's going to do it with her mask off. So I'm just blithely writing down and doing my assignment, thinking I'm doing a great job. And I heard it, but I didn't respond. They said, Wally, put your mask on. Wally, put your mask on. But you see, I was already in another state of deterioration of no oxygen to the brain. And they let me go as long as possible. Then somebody just slapped the mask on me, and then everything came clear as a bell. And I wrote, and I looked down at what I'd writing, and it was all scribble. And not only had I not stopped at the end of the page here, I'd gone out into infinity and thinking I was just doing great. So that was the high altitude test. And the last test was phase 3, which was conducted at the VA hospital in Oklahoma City, and that's where we're put into the tank, as I had described earlier.
What an interesting array of tests that you went through.
And then on top of it, in the 80s, I went to space camp for a week. So I've done everything I could possibly do to learn and grasp more about the wonderful world of space travel.
That's great. It's good to see you being so interested in maintaining that enthusiasm that helps to pass it on to others.
Absolutely. Kids today have a wealth of knowledge if they just have parents or a teacher to say, you can do anything you want to do and go after it. The encouragement of going after it. Taking all the math and science and engineering courses throughout, and kids are on computers today. The youngsters that I'm teaching to fly today, I've got 16 and 17-year-old this summer that I'm teaching. They're grasping, and I'm soloing, they're grasping flying, and I'm soloing them at 7 and 8 hours because of the computer industry that they're learning to fly on the computers. So this is pretty neat.
A whole new way to learn.
Yeah. I mean, there was no way to teach me. When I learned by the seat of my pants. And you show me, then I respond. And that's exactly how I learned how to fly. It wasn't really out of reading a book. It was show and tell. So in my acrobatic instructions, I would look at the picture, have somebody show me, and off I'd go.
A good way to learn, just by doing it as you go. While you were doing the testing, shortly after that, they had congressional hearings actually dealing with bringing women in as astronauts when NASA was hiring the second group of male astronauts. Were you aware of those at the time, or?
I can't really remember. I don't remember exactly where I was at that period of time, and I've been asked that over and over again, and I don't think that any of us knew what Jerry and Janie Hart had to prepare themselves to do to go and defend us as a group. Now, mind you, we didn't know each other yet. And so I knew Jackie Cochran. She had been very generous to support Phase 1 financially. And I've had wonderful letters from her and from Jerry Cobb, but I didn't realize, either I was out of the country or I was so buried in my work that I didn't realize until after it was over with that these hearings had gone on. And then that's when we found out the parameters are jet test pilot experience to be an astronaut, which let us out of the league.
For the time being, at least.
Yes, yes. Thank you for adding that, because Eileen did it. We have 3 girl test pilots, and I think we've got 2 female, or Eileen and another gal that are testing, so that, because Eileen has to have a backup, girl backup.
And hopefully we'll be seeing more and more as time's going on.
Absolutely.
You went on, as you said, you were traveling overseas for lengths of time. You had your career in aviation. Tell us some about that, if you would, an overview of what you continued to do.
I kind of went over to, well, I went over to Russia with 2 goals in mind: to see the Paris Air Show and to meet Valentina Tereshkova, because she had already gone up in '63, and I was in Russia in '65. So I saw the Paris Air Show. I went to Russia by myself, scared to death, on a train from Vienna to Moscow, and I never got to meet her. And I was being sponsored to get to Russia to meet her, but the Russians didn't. This was Cold War time. They did not want us to meet. They said sent she and her husband off, they said, to Japan. So there I was in Russia by myself for 1 week. That's what my ticket allowed me to be there for. And it was an interesting experience going over on the train. When you get to the border between Poland and Russia, they stop the train. Everybody has to get off for a good hour, and nobody knows what's going on. And they tried to give me shots. They took my passport away, and it was a little spooky. Got everything back. Said, nope, you're not sticking me with any needles. And got back on board, and no more knowledgeable of why they took us off. But when I went through, I was in Russia now, or in Moscow, I got to see a lot of the things that they wanted me to see. The university, the Kremlin, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Didn't dare speak to anybody. Nobody would speak to me. But getting back on the train to go back to Vienna, when we got to that border crossing, I decided to play sick and stay on the train. I wanted to know what was going on. So, of course, they came and pulled all the shades down and said, "You stay right there." Ah, yabo. And when they left, the guards left, I peeked underneath one of the blinds and took a picture. And what they were doing is they had great big forks, and they came and they lifted each train car up and slid a narrower track underneath them and set it back down. So Russia had real wide tracks in their country, and the rest of Europe had narrower tracks. And this was one of their ways of protecting Russia from any high-speed train going into their country. So
well,
this is,
that's interesting.
Yeah. And then in those days, we didn't know how the Russians were landing. It was my second trip over to Russia when I really got to meet Valentina Tereshkova, and I asked for 2 interpreters in Russian and 2 interpreters in English, because I wanted to know what was going on here. And we were the first tourists ever to be taken into Star City. And this is like the astronaut center of Houston would be. But tourists were never allowed in there. And on the wall, you could see the re-entry, which we all as Americans thought that the cosmonauts came down in the Soyuz and landed with their parachutes. Not so. When the Soyuz got into the troposphere, a manhole cover blew off the Soyuz, and the astronaut was ejected out. And they came down in their own parachute stuff, and the Soyuz came down in its own parachute rig. So this means they didn't reach all of the goals of making a first, because when you go into the rules of IAC in Paris are that when you want to make a record-breaking situation, You go up with your vehicle, you come down with your vehicle. And they didn't come down with their vehicle. So this is the first that we knew what kind of shenanigans they were pulling.
Interesting. Did you get to take a picture of that wall to
I sure
bring
did.
back and show? Interesting.
And I got 45 minutes with Valentina. My first questions were, how did your parents feel? Well, she had been taken from her parents as a child. The father went to one labor camp, the mother went to another labor camp. She was raised in a child labor camp. And she was brought up as a textile factory worker, and everybody can have in Russia can have an extracurricular activity. Hers was parachuting. So then you put it together. And obviously, they took her for her parachuting qualities. I think she had about 350 jumps.
Wow.
And they say that she really hadn't been schooled that much on the capsule, and she was told what to do. This is what kind of is interesting, the fact that we could have done it if they would just let us. A dog did it, a monkey did it, man did it, woman can do it. We had to wait, what, 30-some years for Eileen to do it, show us.
Unfortunately, but good for
Oh,
finally.
yes. Finally for progress.
Was it fascinating to be able to meet Valentina Tereshkova and talk with her? And
Very, but she was very guarded. And of course she would be. She held the position in Moscow as the First Lady. And rather interesting, if you lived in a block of buildings and you were to report to her if there was any misconduct in your building, it was your Russian duty to report to her. If you overheard anything, if anything was against the government, and this is the way they worked their system.
very different society.
In fact, when our astronauts go over, and I've heard this from Shannon, it was a terrible time. The food, the quality, the housing, the clothing, the fact that Shannon didn't get all her gear for a month up into the Soyuz and into the module that they were circling the Earth with, was really too bad. But she told me a bit about her experiences, and I'm looking forward to going to Russia, and I hope it'll be a little bit different than what Shannon experienced. But yet when we have the Russians come over to America, what do? We put them up in a nice place to stay, a car or chauffeur-driven car, clothing, great experiences. But this is just the difference in cultures. You're right.
Very interesting differences. Quite. You continued to be a pioneer in aviation and for women. You went on to work with the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board. How did those opportunities arise for you? How did you find out about the openings and move into them, and what did you do?
Quite by accident. I'd probably been at the right place at the right time. I was chief pilot for a company out in California. I took a lot of wealthy people back and forth to Vegas all times of the night. Interesting enough, men made their decision-making and shook hands over deals in the airplane that I was carrying them in, going to Vegas and back. Not necessarily so much coming back, but going. I was applying for a professorship in the University of Alaska, and I'd used an FAA chap's name that I had known. And he said, "Wally, what is this? You be in my office at 9 o'clock Monday morning." I said, "Oh, okay." I was there, and he says, "You're set up for an interview next Monday morning because we want you to be an investigator. I mean, an inspector for the FAA." I said, "Oh my goodness. Well, that takes an awful lot of education. I don't know if I can do that." "Of course I can do that." Caught myself. "Of course I can do that. I can be the first girl inspector for the FAA." And I had my interview, and my first boss was Bill Glenn. And I answered all their questions, And then I asked them all about the FAA and what they expected of me and what I was going to, where was I going to go with the FAA. And he says, I like her line of questioning, you're hired. So I was with the FAA, had a great time with them for 4 years, then NTSB stole me over, and then I became an investigator for the rest of my tenure until I retired in '84. And I've done over 450 accidents, whether they're large or small.
That must be a challenge.
It was a great challenge, yes. But very interesting, and every accident investigation was different.
Absolutely. I'm sure it was a learning experience, too, to see all the different considerations, safety considerations, and things to watch out for.
That's correct. You hit on a very good word of safety, because most of the accidents, there has been a safety problem with that accident, either by a pilot not taking heed, or maybe the mechanic, or maybe the aircraft itself. That's why, one of the reasons why I retired early, because I wanted to take my Wally Funk safety slide presentation on the world, around the world, in the United States, to universities and colleges, and show them why people crash into mountains on a clear day. It's incredible. I mean, in the middle of Arizona is Taylor Mountain, or no, excuse me, Flagstaff. I can't recall the name of the mountain right now. Nothing around it, and yet I've done several accidents where people were coming and going right into that particular peak, and that was the only peak for maybe hundreds of miles. I climbed that one many times. I've gotten to many accidents by horse, by mule, by helicopter, by rappelling, by being dropped down, by boat, walking, you name it, I've gotten there.
Quite an active life you've had.
Yes, I've loved every bit of it. Wouldn't change it for the world.
That's great. I hope that I'm able to say that and still be enjoying life as much as you in my own few years.
Well, I've got a lot to do. I've got 50 more years of stuff to do, so
Absolutely.
I got to keep on going.
And I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. When you mentioned earlier that you hadn't known any of the women that went through the mercury testing with you at the time. You knew Jerry Cobb and Jackie Cochran, but not the others that had passed, and that you only got to meet them a few years ago. What was that like?
It was pretty neat. Being the youngest, I was outvoted on who was going to talk first, so I sat there and listened a lot. And I did have my camera, so I got to film a lot of what was going on in the various impromptu little clutches that we would get into. And every time we get together, there's more stories that come out, because they've all thought of things, especially some of the girls that went together. Now, see, I was by myself, so I didn't have anybody to talk to. But they, being older, could have each other to talk to, or they talked more to the doctors and the nurses more than I would be. I just considered myself a subject, and I was there to take tests, and I didn't ask questions, and I just was there. So I still listen, want to listen to their stories, because I didn't have the fascinating stories. I've told you some of my experiences, but some of them were like Sarah Ratley. She said she had her hair all done up the day before she went to Loveless. And of course, the minute you go in, you're handed a weekly sheet of expectations, and the first thing was, wash your hair thoroughly and don't do anything with it. And you're going to take an enema, da-da-da-da-da-da. So we did everything we were supposed to.
Amazing. Interesting. Interesting. And now, how have you kept in contact then, since you've all met? Have you kept up a regular correspondence or meetings?
Well, we have Jerry Truehill, kind of is our gal that everybody calls and gives information to. And when we come down here to the Cape to see Eileen off, we all get together, those of us that can still travel.
That's good. That's great to see you all still keeping together and keeping up. Well, when did you find out that Eileen was going to have the opportunity to pilot the shuttle?
Gosh, I think we met back in mid-'80s. She had just been hired by NASA at Women in Aviation Conference in Las Vegas. And the Women in Aviation is a large organization now that encompasses all girls that want to fly around the world, whether you want to do fly for the airlines or for commuters, or as I am, a chief pilot, or just as a beginning flight student, or a NASA individual like Eileen. We've all been speakers, and this has opened the floodgates to let people know there's an organization for young people to come to find out about military, to find out what's out there for them. And Peggy Beatty from Dayton, Ohio is the one that has started this organization. And we've just had our 10th anniversary. We meet the second week of every March somewhere in the United States. And Women in Aviation International has probably given out hundreds of thousands of scholarships for the airline industry, for anything that any girl wants to apply for. And those things are out there. We teach people how to get a hold of scholarships, to use Pell Grants. None of this was even remotely thought of 15 years ago when I wasn't struggling 15 minutes, but when I was struggling to getting my licenses, and what Jerry and all the rest of the girls had to do to get their licenses.
That's wonderful to be able to work with a young generation and to help them have the exciting experiences you have.
Yes, and when you interview the WASPs, you'll find you're going back in time even more, and they helped open the gates for us in Women in Aviation and for us getting into some of the space program.
And I'm guessing many of them are involved in the Women in Aviation
Absolutely. Group? Oh, and also the Forest of Friendship inducted quite a few ladies in Atchison, Kansas in middle of June this year, and I suspect there were about 20 there. Yes. You see, there's about 4 or 5 organizations where we all see each other through the year, whether you're a helicopter pilot, fixed-wing pilot, Women in Aviation, or Forest of Friendship up at Amelia Earhart's hometown of Atchison, Kansas.
A good network.
Yes.
Very good network.
Yes, a great network today.
You mentioned all the different types of pilots there can be, and you've flown a variety of different aircraft, if I'm correct. Was there a favorite that you had?
Yes, it's a Stearman. It's an old bi-wing, open cockpit airplane, and I owned one as a youngster, as a 22-year-old in Hawthorne, California. Silly me, I sold it when I wanted to go overseas because I couldn't get anybody to work on the radial engine. And jets were just coming in, and of course, to find a mechanic to work on a radial or a cylinder type of an engine when they could be out there working on a jet engine, unheard of. I sold it for, audience will love this, $3,000. Today, that airplane is worth, in good shape, $130,000. Oh. So, and I'll go up to somebody that's got a nice Stearman, and I'll say, well, I guess I can I have a ride? Can I pay for a ride? I used to own one of these. I've got about 3,000 hours in one, and T6s and Wacos, all the old warbirds. Well, I don't know. You have to take our course. Okay, let's go for a ride.
Oh, that.
But I did make a advertisement in the early '80s for Merrill Lynch, and I flew a Stearman. And I did all kinds of acrobatics and did a big enough loop where I could have a helicopter run through. And it was wonderful because Mother could be in the chase plane, and she had never seen me perform. And ride as for Merrill Lynch, as I went into the sun, the bull was coming out of the sun, and then I had some words to say. But as we were going back home and the sun was setting, Mother was in the chase plane and I was right next to her, and we were just both tears coming down our eyes because we could be up in the air together. She had her wish and passed on to her daughter with the gene of flying.
That's wonderful. That must have meant so much to her.
And I didn't know about the gene until about 4 years ago. She just had told me.
Your mother sounds like a really wonderful woman.
She was. She was great. She was everything to me.
That's great. It's nice to have so much support, too, at home. That must have helped in your career and being able to have so much fun at what you did, to have her as such a support and a friend.
Yeah, they both were. But mind you, I grew up in an area where you had free spirit. There was no reins. I was brought up by the Indians of the Taos Pueblo, and they taught me how to fish and hunt and camp at a very early age and survive the wilderness. So I had all that going for myself, where a youngster today is in a city in an apartment and that's all they know. They don't know ocean and skiing and snow and air as I was able to know it. And that's why I thank the good Lord for putting me where He put me.
You were in a wonderful environment, it sounds like.
Thank you.
The future. We were talking earlier, and you have quite an exciting future in front of you. You mentioned going over to Russia to do the training, but you're also gearing up for?
Yes, I'm gearing up to go into space, and it's really going to happen. I always knew, even though the Mercury tests were stopped, I knew that I would one day go up. I was in my bones. I knew it. And sure enough, a company called Zigram Voyages out of Seattle, Washington, has the plans to put a vehicle into space with a space cruiser attached underneath. And what will happen is that the mothership will take the space cruiser up to the troposphere and peel off, and then the space cruiser will then go into orbit. And they'll only have 9 of us on board. It's going to take a lot of training before we get to go up. But my Space Star City training will help for that, of course. And I'm going to have my nose pressed against that window as hard as it can go and watch what the astronauts see when they go around. And I'm not going to have any duties.
Now that's the best
Yes.
way to go.
I'm going to go as a paying passenger.
And be able to look all you want.
That's right.
That will be fabulous. Hopefully we'll be able to have a chance to sit
You
down and
will.
talk afterwards.
Maybe you can come to the launch, because the launch will be somewhere in California, because you see the vehicle will be able to take off and land at an airport.
Oh, that's great.
That's how it's being designed.
I will put it in on my calendar.
All right.
Definitely be there.
2002 or 2003?
Absolutely. Looking back, what was the most challenging aspect for you in your career?
Ooh. Career, not tests.
Well, tests too.
Well, no, I can't say that my tests have been a challenge, because I went in not knowing what was going to happen to me. So nothing was preconceived. Challenging, I suspect when I was an investigator and going to all the schools that the NTSB allowed me, I went to 5 schools a year. I went to every aircraft manufacturer, engine manufacturer, propeller manufacturer, and any of your parts that go with any of the engines. That was challenging. Going to an accident investigation, a large magnitude, was challenging. But we always came up with a solution. Today it takes much longer because we're having more accidents, unfortunately. And we don't have the manpower, the people power. But in my tenure in the office in Los Angeles, We had 3 states, the entire South Pacific, to have as our territory, and there were only 6 of us. So we were really scattered, and I was on the road